Hi, this is Aidan from Kentan Engineering. I'm going to show you guys how to install this Kentan remote racking device for the Schneider MTZ2 right beside me, and I'll take you through it now. Okay, so inside your box, your installation box, you have your installation manual along with these parts. The first step of installing your remote racking device is to ensure that your breaker is isolated. You're then going to remove this mechanism cover using 6 bolts, which are on these sides. You must then retain your bolts, however the mechanism cover can be discarded. Step 2 is to knock these 2 erect pins flat, which have already been done. You can do this with a hammer. Step 3 is to install the pin adapter, which can be installed here. Next, ensure that your grub screw is flush and locked tight. Next, in order to help with your installment of your split sprocket, is to move it out of isolated into test. I've already put the bottom split sprocket on, and then you take your top split sprocket. It may be helpful to hold the bottom while you install the top and it clicks on. And just remember to screw these in, and after that to place it back into isolated. Next is to install the chain. We're going to do this by pushing down the teeth. The tip is to push this down hard, and I know it's in isolation, but we're going to have to remove it from isolation in order to install the chain. We can do this by running it back. Okay, now that the chain is installed and we have the chain aid on like this, we're able to move on to step 4. Step 4 is to take a 6mm drill and chamfer the top hole here on the lock bar in order for the lock bar filter to sit flush on the plate. Now that the plate is installed, you can pull the lock bar back in order to tighten the nylon knot back here. Now on your remote racking device, remove this cable on your shaft encoder and take these 2 screws out and set this aside. Okay, step 6 is to keep the racker raised and pull the chain through this slot. Now we're going to install this wedge to keep the lock bar out. However, if this keeps falling out, I like to use whatever's lying around really in order to keep the lock bar out. This is an Allen key. Step 7 is to align the grooves in the plate with the grooves on the shaft. We're going to keep the chain taut. We're going to align the hole with the pin below it, and we're going to align the jaws with the crank slide. In order to install this, we're going to make sure to lift the back and slide it in. You're next going to check that the mechanism is sitting flush. You may then remove the wedge from the lock bar. Ensure that the lock bar is moving freely and through that sensor. You're then going to take your crankshaft and test that it moves there and that it is connected and moves freely. Okay, so after we've made sure the mechanism is sitting flush, we've checked the lock bar sensor and we've checked the crankshaft sensor, we're going to install those 6 screws that we removed earlier. Step 10 is to assemble the chain. You can use the crankshaft to rotate the chain to a position where it is easier to assemble. I find this to be middle center. When in this position, you use the chain link in order to join the 2 ends of the chain together. Okay, now that the chain is assembled, we're going to push it back until the chain is taut, and then we're going to tighten the 3 screws. Just as a tip, I like to put a little blob of grease on the chain in order to make sure that it runs smoothly. Step 11 is to reinstall the shaft angle sensor. We're going to use the jig in order to keep correct spacing between the sensor and the shaft, and we're going to install it back into its original position. You're going to want to route the cable underneath the motor in order to get it back into the plug. Step 12 is installing the shaft encoder filter. We're going to accomplish this by having the side with lots of castellations on the right side, and we're going to line the grooves up with the sensors on the shaft encoder sensor. Now that we have it fitted with the grooves running between the sensors, we can now install zip ties into the grooves on the outside, the 2 grooves here. Do not tighten the zip ties completely, as we will need to calibrate the sensor further. Okay, now that you have installed your zip ties and there's still some play in the shaft encoder, we're going to calibrate it using these 4 LEDs. And they are named LED 0, LED 1, LED 2, and LED 3, making for a total of 4. You're going to begin the calibration of the shaft encoder by rotating the shaft encoder until only LED 0 and LED 1 are illuminated. You are then going to rotate the shaft encoder away from you until only LED 0 is illuminated. Now you're going to rotate the shaft encoder further away from you until all LEDs are extinguished. And finally, you're going to rotate the shaft encoder back towards you until only LED 0 goes from extinguished to full illumination. Now that the shaft encoder has been calibrated, we're going to tighten the zip ties and trim them down. We are then going to rotate the bulbous ends directly to the bottom in order to prevent it from touching the cover upon rotation. In order to maintain the calibration of the shaft encoder sensor, ensure that you hold the encoder tightly while you push the bulbous ends to the bottom. And now that that is completed, you can now apply glue to the adhesive point here. Okay, we have fully finished the installation of the remote racking device. I'm going to demonstrate some tests just to make sure that everything is all right. If we pull the lock bar out, we should get a fault. And finally, if we put in the crankshaft, we should get a fault. So now that we have done all the final checks, I'm going to demonstrate the unit to you by placing it into test. A faster flashing indicates that the motor has slowed down so that there is not a strong impact. Now that we've reached the test position, I'll now put it into the connected position. A slow flash indicates that the mechanism is moving faster. Now that we're in the connected position, we want to make sure that our zip tie bulbs are not above the shaft so that the mechanism cover can go on. One last thing to do is to put it back into the isolated position so that we can put the mechanism cover on. And that's the installation of the remote racking device. Thank you for choosing Kentan. You can visit us at kentan.com.au.